What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka NYPrepper. Just wanted to talk to you guys about what would happen if Putin nuked Ukraine. And this is something that's been on the mind of many people for the last couple of weeks. And it's something that I've been talking about for months now. And I've said since the beginning of the war that Putin could nuke Ukraine out of desperation, out of frustration. And it's safe to say that Putin is starting to get frustrated. He expected to basically take over Ukraine in a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months. But the Ukrainians have pushed back his military, and he's gotten to the point where he had to issue a full-scale mobilization or draft. Okay, so now he's drafting upwards of 2 million people, possibly. So it's safe to say that Putin is slowly starting to run out of options. His economy is crashing from all the sanctions, and Ukraine basically has unlimited resupply now. All Western countries are giving Ukraine endless amounts of ammunition, weapons, supplies, and even some advanced air defense systems and advanced weapons systems. So at this point, Putin cannot win conventionally, and he might start to realize that soon, and that's when he might reach for the nukes, okay? So what would happen if Putin nukes Ukraine? First, I want to talk about what type of nukes he would use, okay? So if you haven't seen my nuclear war survival videos, I recommend you watch them because that'll help you understand more of what I'm talking about here. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, you have, generally speaking, you have air burst and surface burst. Those are the two most common types of nuclear weapons. You also have a subsurface burst, which is a bunker buster designed to penetrate hardened structures underground and destroy them. And then you have a high altitude burst, which is an EMP. But if we're talking about traditional nuclear weapons, we're going to be talking about either an air burst or a ground burst or surface burst, okay? Now, an air burst means that the warhead is actually detonated up to a mile above the ground, okay? And when you detonate an explosive above ground, what happens is the blast wave or the overpressure propagates much further because you don't have the ground to absorb it. So with an air burst, you have more damage over a larger area, but you have less concentrated damage. So it's kind of like the difference between a shotgun and a rifle. Okay, with a shotgun, you shoot a lot of pellets and the pellets spread out and you can hit a large area with it, but the pellets don't have as much power as a single rifle bullet, okay? It's kind of the same thing, all right? When you air burst a nuclear warhead, the blast wave propagates much further, but because it's above ground, the blast is not as powerful. However, it propagates further. So depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to damage a hardened structure, then you don't want to use an air burst. You want to use a surface burst. You want to have that warhead land right on top of the hardened structure and then detonate. And this way, all of that explosive power is concentrated on that hardened structure, okay? With an air burst, you're detonating above the ground, so you don't have as much concentrated damage, but it spreads out further. So that's the type of detonation you want to use if you want to destroy a large city or you want to destroy a large congregation of troops, because you don't need a tremendous amount of explosive power or overpressure, but you want to destroy a large area. You want that blast wave to propagate several miles in all directions from the detonation point, and you don't need a tremendous amount of overpressure to topple a building, to destroy residential homes, even commercial buildings. You don't need a lot of overpressure, okay? So you don't need that warhead to detonate right on top of the ground in a city. You don't need it to go all the way to the ground, because if it goes all the way to the ground is going to absorb the power. Okay, you want that to detonate right above your city, and then the blast wave will propagate across the whole city and topple everything and destroy everything. Okay, so in my opinion, if Putin nukes Ukraine, he's mostly going to use air-bursted nuclear warheads. And the reason why is because there's no specific targets for Putin to actually have to hit with a ground burst. There's not a lot of bunkers in Ukraine. There might be a few. For example, Zelensky probably has a bunker. I'm sure the mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, probably has a bunker. So there might be a couple of bunkers in Kiev, and there might be some other bunkers scattered throughout Ukraine. But Ukraine doesn't have, for example, missile silos or some kind of underground base or something like America has, like Strategic Command or Cheyenne Mountain. They don't have anything like that. So for the most part, Putin is going to use air bursts, which is good and bad. It's good because there's not going to be as much fallout, because when a nuclear warhead detonates above the ground, if it's detonated about a mile above the ground or half a mile above the ground, the fireball doesn't come into contact with anything, okay? The fireball is existing in open air, okay? So there's nothing to be vaporized and turned into ash, okay? If you detonate a warhead at ground level, and let's say you detonate a warhead right at the New York Stock Exchange, right on Wall Street at ground level, all the buildings around are going to be vaporized by the fireball. The fireball is as hot as the core of the sun, okay? So everything within the fireball is instantly vaporized and turned into ash and debris, and that debris gets sucked up into the mushroom cloud, and then it goes up into the atmosphere, and then atmospheric winds carry that debris downwind, and then it settles down onto the ground. It falls out. That's why it's called fallout. It falls out of the sky, and it's heavy. It's like sand. It's not like dust, like people think. They watch too many movies. They think that fallout is like dust that floats in the air. No, it's not like that. It's like sand, okay? Sand falling from the sky, and the sand is radioactive, all right? So with an airburst, because you're not contacting anything with the fireball, there's not going to be as much fallout. So that's the good news, okay? So if you are concerned about fallout going into Europe, if you have family in Eastern Europe, for example, me, I have family in Poland. I'm not super worried about the fallout, because I believe Putin would mostly use airbursts. And it would also be smart for him to use airbursts because it's close to his borders, so he doesn't want radiation going into Russia either. Okay, so, it would make sense for him to use airbursts, but that's a huge thing that you need to understand. If Putin nukes Ukraine, he's probably going to mostly use airbursts. He might use some ground bursts, maybe even some subsurface bursts, just to target maybe Zelensky's bunker or some other VIP bunkers or something that's hardened. But for the most part, he'll probably use air bursts. He might also detonate a few high-altitude weapons, okay, to generate an EMP and black out the whole country. He could do that, all right? But I would say 2/3 to 3/4 will be air-bursted warheads, and then you might have 1/3 or even less ground-bursted, and maybe you'll have some high altitude, okay? So that's good in the sense that you don't have as much fallout, but it's bad because it's going to create more damage over a larger area, okay? So I believe he's going to go after cities with air-bursted nuclear weapons, okay? The reason why he's going to go after cities is because when the war started, most of the Ukrainian military dispersed, okay? They're not concentrated in specific areas. They don't have any major forward operating bases like the United States had in Afghanistan, like Bagram Air Base or something like that. They don't have anything like that. The Ukrainian military dispersed, and they're fighting almost like a partisan army. They don't have large concentrations of troops, and they did that on purpose so they're not vulnerable to a Russian missile attack. Okay, so that was done by design. So because there's no large concentrated area of troops, it's going to be hard for Putin to target Ukrainian troops. So in my opinion, for him to maximize the effect of the nuclear attack, he would probably want to go after some cities, okay? Sad to say, but he would probably go after some cities. He might go after Kiev. If he goes after Kiev, he would probably do 1 or 2 airbursts to level the city, and then he might do a couple of smaller ground bursts to target Zelensky and the VIPs in Kiev and try to take them out with bunker busters and stuff like that, okay? So, you know, it's hard to say that, but that's just the reality. I know a lot of people are going to think I'm crazy, but that's just the reality. And if you don't think that Putin has thought about this, then you're nuts, okay? He's thought about all different scenarios, and believe me, I'm far from being a Putin fan. If you've watched my channel for a while, you know that I hate him, but that's just the reality, okay? So mostly air-bursted weapons. It's going to target cities, less fallout, more damage across larger areas. So after he hits Ukraine with the nukes, that's when things get really interesting, okay? NATO is going to have to intervene, in my opinion. They're not just going to sit back and do nothing. If he nukes Ukraine, it's going to set a precedent for China, North Korea, Iran, and they're going to be watching, and they're going to be like, well, look what Putin did. You know, he nuked Ukraine and got away with it. So that means we can go after Taiwan, or we can go after South Korea, or we can go after Israel, okay? So NATO is going to be forced to intervene, in my opinion. So I think NATO will do something, and we have heard some senior officials in NATO. We heard Joseph Borrell, the top diplomat of the EU, say that Russian troops would be annihilated if Putin nuked Ukraine. We also had a senior NATO official say that they would do something, okay, if Putin nuked Ukraine. We also had several retired generals, American generals, say that America would target Russian troops and equipment in Ukraine. So what would a NATO intervention look like? In my opinion, they don't really have a whole lot of options here, because if they go after Russian troops, it could trigger a nuclear war, okay? So they basically have 3 options, or 4 options. The first option, they can use nukes on Russia. I don't think they would do that. The second option is they could use a conventional strike on Russian troops and Russian equipment. And the third option is they could just go after Russian equipment without the troops. And the fourth option is that they do nothing and just give Ukraine more advanced weapons. So those are the 4 main options. In my opinion, what I think NATO would do is they would go after Russian equipment in Ukraine. I don't think they would target Russian troops, because they don't want to escalate the war and make it seem like they're attacking Russian people. They want to seem like they're the good guy, so they're not going to go after Russian troops necessarily, but I do think they would target things like Russian air defense sites, Russian radars, bases, airfields, any kind of tanks or armored equipment that they can see on satellite images or other types of ISR. So I think they would go after the equipment, not so much the troops. And that's what I think would happen, okay? And as far as targets, what would Putin target? Like I said, he would hit the cities, but which cities in particular? In my opinion, he would go after the biggest cities: Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, Kherson. He could also just do like a small attack and just go after, let's say, Kherson and maybe Donetsk or Zaporizhia, and just hit 2 or 3 sites just to intimidate Ukraine, rather than launching 10 or 20 nukes. So there's two different types of options here. He could do a limited strike, very limited, just maybe detonate one nuke in Kherson or somewhere else, or maybe over the Black Sea or something. He could do that. Or he could go all out, and if he goes all out, he would probably target all of the cities in Ukraine, possibly even Lviv, which is just a few miles from Poland. And if he does that, that could definitely bring NATO into it, because that's right next to Poland, and the fallout would go into Poland, okay? Even if it's an airburst, there still would be some radiation because it's so close to the Polish border. So that's how I think it would play out for the most part. And what would happen after that? I think possibly World War III or nuclear war, okay? If we strike Russian equipment in Ukraine, I believe Putin would just totally lose it and decide to launch a couple of nukes at us here in the United States and in Europe. So make sure you guys are prepared, because that's a very real possibility, okay? As far as where the fallout would go, in my opinion, if Putin is going to nuke Ukraine, he's going to do it in the winter time. And the reason why is in the winter, the wind blows from east to west, okay? The cold air comes from Siberia, the Siberian high, and that blows the cold air into Eastern Europe. So it would make the most sense for him to do a nuclear attack on Ukraine in the middle of winter. So this way, if there is any fallout, it's going to blow away from Russia and not into Russia, okay? If he did it in the summertime, the prevailing winds go from west to east. So the fallout, if there is any fallout, would go towards Russia. Now, if he does a full-scale nuclear attack, I'm not talking about one or two just to make an example or intimidate Ukraine. I'm talking about a full-scale decapitating strike on Ukraine. That's the proper word, is decapitating. So what would a full-scale decapitating strike on Ukraine look like? He would probably use a combination of air bursts, ground bursts, and high-altitude bursts for EMP effects. And that's where things could get really dangerous, because if Putin decides to use EMPs to take out the whole grid of Ukraine, those EMPs could possibly hit Europe, and Eastern Europe in particular, like places like Poland or Romania that are right on the border of Ukraine. They could get hit with that EMP effect and have some blackouts in certain areas close to Ukraine. And that's where NATO would have to get involved, because that would basically be an attack on NATO. So if Putin were to retaliate against America, if we were to intervene after he nukes Ukraine, what would his retaliation back at us look like? Well, he basically has two options. He can either go for a full-scale decapitating strike on America, and that would basically be the worst-case scenario that all of us fear, is Putin would launch his entire arsenal at the United States and try to decapitate our military, decapitate our nuclear arsenal, neutralize our government, and then we would do the exact same thing to him, okay, to his government, his military. So that would be the worst-case scenario. It's a possibility because Putin's getting older and he's crazy. He may feel like, if I'm going to go out, I'm going to take everyone with me. I don't know, but that would be one option, okay, a full-scale decapitating strike on America, which would lead to basically global nuclear war, and then we would retaliate. As soon as Putin would launch the missiles at us, we would automatically launch ours. That's how nuclear war works, okay? So if we get information from satellites and geospatial intelligence that there's 1,000 nukes coming our way, we're going to launch 1,000 back, and neutralize his whole government, his whole military, everything, okay? So that would be one option, full-scale decapitating strike on America and Europe. The other option is it could be a limited nuclear strike. He could choose to specifically target some areas in Europe. He could try to target, let's say, Poland, that area where Poland is bringing in all the international support for Ukraine. There's an airport in Poland. They could possibly target that. They could target some important bases in Europe, in Western Europe. So there's a lot of different targets there, but they could also go after some targets in America. It could be a limited strike. They could, let's say, hit a couple of our cities, maybe 5 cities, and then we would hit 5 cities of theirs. And then both of us would just say, all right, I think we should just stop now. You know, that could be one possible scenario, okay, a limited exchange where they launch a couple at us, we launch a couple back, and then they decide, all right, it's not worth escalating anymore. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen, guys, but just make sure you're rushing all of your preps to completion. I think there's a really good chance that Putin could nuke Ukraine. So if there's any loose ends, make sure you get those tied up as soon as possible. But that's pretty much it for this one, guys. Check out my nuclear war survival videos. I have 44 videos on nuclear war survival where I go in depth about all of these topics. So I'll leave links in the top right corner of this video. But that's all I got for now. Take care. May God bless you. May God bless America. And don't forget the 3 Ps. Prepare, practice, and persevere.